William S. McFeely, author of Proximity to Death. What is the proximity to death that you experienced that prompted this book?
Well, really, the story is that I was sitting in my office at the University of Georgia. I'm a historian of the 19th century, essentially. And the telephone rang, and a gentleman said, "I'm Stephen Bright." It took me a couple of clicks to recall that I had heard of him, but hadn't met him. I wanted to, because I'd heard he's very good. He needed an expert witness, and that's where the historian comes in. He wanted someone who would be able to talk about the Confederate battle flag, which was carried into battle in the war, but also used by the Klan as its emblem after the war, and put on the Georgia state flag in 1956 as perfectly obvious. It was, at the time, it was perfectly clear that it was part of the whole effort of massive resistance to integration. And he was trying to argue that a black person couldn't get equal protection under the 14th Amendment in a room in which the Confederate battle flag was flying. And of course, the state flag hangs in all the courtrooms. I said to him, you know, no judge is really going to take that seriously. He said, no, and went on. He wanted to bring up any issue. He also wanted someone, here was this, my historian knowledge came into it again, who was aware of the crowds that used to gather to celebrate a lynching in the late 19th century, and wanted to make a rough analogy to the crowds that now gather at the time of an execution and cheer and celebrate when the hearse drives out, knowing that someone has indeed been killed. So I did my homework and got ready for this and went over there to the courthouse that Thursday. And I was just fascinated from the start. It took me an hour into the proceedings to really persuade myself that the very well pulled together young, or not so young, 35 perhaps, a year-old black gentleman at the table with a shaved head, fashionably shaved head, and nice wire-rimmed glasses and a good blue suit, perusing a bunch of legal documents, that he was, in fact, the kidnapper, rapist, and murderer who'd been convicted. And the appeals lawyers had managed, through an appeals process, to get him another trial, and he'd been convicted again. And now this was a hearing prior to a trial which will be held. In Georgia, the jury decides who is delivered to die, and there will be a trial. And as the day went on, I just was fascinated with the dynamic between the deputy sheriffs and the convict, the judge, and particularly the lawyers, who were just this remarkably lively group. It was Stephen Bright, but it was Palmer Singleton, and a young woman straight out of Harvard Law School, and they were just terrific. At the end of the day, he had the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan on the stand, because that man had been at the execution some years earlier of a co-defendant. They were tried separately, and the co-defendant was executed. And the day was just, it's courtroom drama. I just was very excited about it. And on the way back to Athens, Georgia, where the university is, that night I just said to myself, I've got to write this book. And Bright agreed that I could come in and work with the records of the cases. And so I spent a lot of time in this little cramped office on Poplar Street, almost an alley, right next to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals building in Atlanta. And I was just so impressed with these lawyers. Later on, I met two of their clients. They're always thought of as clients. They always know their client's biography. They know the whole life. And I met a couple of them, had long talks with them.
Let me go back to, you said you knew that you had to write this book. What was your thinking? What was the inspiration? What happened in that courtroom that caused you to write a book?
I've always been opposed to the death penalty, but only in just sort of a general way. I was pleased when it wasn't by a narrow vote, wasn't returned to the state of Massachusetts, for example. But
is that where you?
I live now, and I've lived for a long time, other than the 11 years that I was living in Georgia. And that sort of general approach to the subject, I'm like a great many Americans, I think, in this. But this was an opportunity, suddenly, to just see it up so close, and it seemed like a very different thing to me when I could face right into it in an immediate, intimate way, to go through the letters that the clients had written to the lawyers write letters to them, keeping them posted where they were in this long, intricate appeal system.
You bring to this the perspective of an historian. You mentioned you're an historian, having been a biographer of Ulysses Grant, Pulitzer Prize winner for that book. Did you find that you approach these contemporary events the same or differently from the way you confront events of the past?
Differently. When I write a biography about a 19th century figure, I stand aside. There's a movement these days to get more intimately into it yourself, but I would stand aside. I would write in the third person. The difference really with Proximity to Death is it just seemed much more honest. A book would be a much more honest book if I were to write myself into it, to simply tell the story of how I experienced this. So it's in the first person, and I talk about these cases. I talk to and about the lawyers, about these defendants, and then ultimately I had the very interesting experience on one case that I traced through from beginning to end of interviewing the jurors and finding out how they stood on it.
And which case was that?
That was William Brooks.
And what was his crime?
He murdered, he's black, and murdered a white woman in Columbus, Georgia. It was, as murders are, it was a very ugly thing. He raped her. He allowed her then to get dressed again. Apparently, we of course don't know, but apparently her extraordinary restraint that she'd shown all through this. I mean, she told her mother that she was all right when her mother saw her driving off in the car she had a gun held at her side. Apparently, when she got dressed again, and her restraint just collapsed and she began to scream, and I think he panicked, and that's when he killed her.
And then your story picks up when?
My story, well, it begins with his first trial, when he was convicted by an all-white jury and was murdered. Because of the murder, he was sentenced to death by a Judge Land. It turns out, in fact, Judge Land is the son of a person who had committed a lynching in 1912, but that's just a side matter. But there's a long history of racial problems in Columbus, Georgia. And William was sentenced to death. And it was then, only that's when these appeals lawyers come in after a sentence of death. And they took it, and the process of appeals was immensely complicated. I had to simplify greatly in the book because it was just extraordinary legal complications involved in this. But they ultimately won a new trial and moved the trial from Muskogee County, where racial strain is very apparent still, to Morgan County, a smaller rural county, which is had its problems too, but it's more benign, more quiet county, I think, than Muskogee. And the jurors, of course, were pulled from the list in that county, which is only really two towns, and all the jurors knew each other, and it was really very interesting to talk to them.
Is this a treatise of any kind, or a screed on the death penalty?
No, it's not, I think. It is perfectly obvious that I'm opposed to the death penalty. I don't try to pretend that I'm not. I don't create some sort of objectivity, an attempt to be objective about it. But on the other hand, I'm not on hope on a soapbox in the book. I want people to perhaps vicariously have the experience of experiences that I've had of watching people who are responsible for life and death. The prosecutors will say the police aren't guilty of, they're not going to kill the person. The judge isn't going to kill the person. The electrician at Jackson is not going to do it. The person who pulls the switch is not going to be responsible. And you, the jurors, are not responsible. The jurors saw right through that fiction. They knew they were responsible, and that was so striking to me, was how their sense of the real world was really very impressive.
You spent a lot of time in the book talking about a man named Stephen Bright. You've already mentioned him. Talk more about him, where he comes from, what kind of attorney he is.
Steve is, I've been accused by one reviewer of making him too much of a hero, but if you know Steve, it's pretty hard not to. He's an extraordinarily charismatic guy. He's from Kentucky. He's still a Kentucky gentleman. He was a student leader, head of the student government at the University of Kentucky back in the 60s, I think 68, and was very, very much an activist. His family a little on edge about his activism, I think. And then he went right on to law school in Kentucky, and his first job was with a public defender firm or group of lawyers working with in rural Kentucky, and then moved on to Washington, D.C. And did public law here. He had never been in a death penalty case, but there was a remarkable woman down in Georgia who was one of two people in the ACLU down there who was watching the increasing number of death penalty cases that were coming along, and she contacted a friend of Stephen Bright's, George Kendall, who is also a marvelously interesting character and is in the book, and the two of them took a case in Georgia, and then shortly after took the case of William Brooks. And when they started it, they thought maybe they would just write a brief that would be sent over to the Supreme Court or some detached thing, and then they discovered that if they were going to keep these people alive, they had to know them, and they went down to Georgia and did so. George Kendall has left, but not left the field. He does death penalty work for the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, and but Steve has been in Georgia ever since, doing these cases. He's got reddish hair, wonderful booming voice.
How old is he?
I think Steve must be close to 50. He still seems in a certain sense boyish. Marvelous zest for things, and he seems to be able to keep himself going. He had one experience that I could not possibly put myself through. He'd been with a client, he'd lost the case. The man was going to be executed. This was in South Carolina. He was with him all the last day before he was executed, sat in the booth and looked through the glass and watched him die. Left the building, got on a plane, and went to Florida and did exactly the same thing the next day.
For another client.
For another client, yes.
You mention in the book at some length a closing argument, I think it was in the William Brooks trial,
yeah,
of Mr. Bright's, that you say is still taught in law schools, or is now taught in law schools today. Could you give us an idea of what that argument was like?
Well, it dwelt very heavily on the fact that William Brooks had experienced really terrible abuse as a child. He had on the stand William Brooks's sister, who recalled a time when she'd come home from school and found the neighbors outside unable to get into the apartment in the projects, and told her that their stepfather had been beating William. They could hear William's screams for hours, and she had a key and got into the building, went up to the room. There was blood all over the wall. The child was whimpering. The stepfather said, if you don't want this to happen to you, get out of here, and really chased her out. She went running off and found an older brother and brought him back, and he finally persuaded the stepfather to stop. But it was a terrible violence that he had suffered as a child. So Stephen Bright dwelt on that, and there were some allusions to redemption, a kind of underplayed, they're not pious folks at all, but underplayed, but a Christian concept of redemption was brought forward, that William was a very different person now, and it was a gentle and model prisoner, so that there was her early life was different from the time of the murder, although it certainly played a very strong part in that murder, and that he was a different person since. It's beautiful oratory. I mean, I used the word oratory when I described it. I could think of no other word that was right. And of course, preaching to the choir, those who agree with him and don't like the death penalty were just, there were tears in their eyes. They remember it vividly. They will tell you just exactly. They will quote from it even. And as you said, it's taught in law schools. I have to admit, I was amused to find that the jurors didn't really even remember it very well at all, although they remembered the details of the trial with great clarity. Whether they're deaf to oratory or because of TV these days, I don't know what it is, but it was a very interesting response.
Well, on that point, let me just read from the book because it struck me. You wrote, "This is not a time when machine shop workers, beauticians, and waitresses, or for that matter, elaborately educated CEOs, expect or respond to the grandeur of language. Other ways of communicating that belong to what we call popular culture speak a language that people do hear and understand. Oratory no longer does." You're a little more definitive in that. Mm-hmm. What implications do you think that has for the whole process of a trial?
I think there are other elements that get through to a jury that I think that oratory can't do. And that's why I mentioned the child abuse. I was sitting in Wendy's with where one of the jurors is the manager, talking to another juror who works in a factory. His children went to, he's white, his children went to school in Madison, in Morgan County, and had as their third grade school teacher Mrs. Juanita Jones, and he had great respect for her, thought she was an excellent teacher. You know, she's black. So we were talking about the whole process. He recalled it with great clarity, and I said, well, look, how was it that finally she prevailed? Incidentally, these jurors come into this so green. I mean, they, for example, did not know, right down to the end, that it only takes one person to hold out for life for life to be the sentence in Georgia. They assumed it had to be unanimous.
Otherwise, the person would be killed.
Yeah. Exactly. So they began to battle it out, and I said to her, to this man that I was talking to, but she had told the judge that she could impose the death penalty, and here she is digging in her heels and just determined to see to it that not perhaps that the death penalty should go, but that William Brooks should get life and his life should not be taken. And I said, but why did she feel this way? And he said, I think it was the child abuse. And then he very quietly said, she's seen so much of it. And so that, as I said before, these jurors live in the real world. And she just began to see that this man had been damaged terribly as a child, and that this was mitigating, and that he shouldn't die.
Back to the making of books, what strange, or maybe it's not so strange, set of circumstances caused you to publish a book by Norton that's run by your son? He is your publisher,
Yes, he is
correct?
indeed. But Drake and I have done, I think, a very good job of staying out of each other's way. I was there with I've been there all along with all of my books. It was very interesting to watch Drake come along and ultimately get to head the house. But as I say, we've been very careful to not tread on each other in there. And I don't get on the phone and then ask him what's going on with this and that, and he doesn't. He does the same with me. We talk about other things. We go sailing together and so on, but not about my books.
Is your view of the legal profession any different now that you've gone through this process?
Yes, it really is. I have, on one hand, enormous admiration for some of the lawyers like this group. But my sense of the criminal justice system altogether is that we are a long way from having the kind of criminal justice system that actually provides justice.
What would you change?
Well, I certainly would change the system of defense. I would have a public defender who is as well paid and as an important a position as the district attorney, the prosecutor. We must find some way, I think, to provide the kind of legal work that is done for indigent clients that somehow truly does equal that which we could get when we're rich. Rich people don't get executed in this country. They get themselves a good lawyer, and it doesn't happen. But there are people who have lawyers who fall asleep, who are drunk, who simply aren't prepared. And even if they undertake it to be an appointed lawyer by the judge, if they undertake to be take it seriously, they don't know how to do capital cases, and they don't know to get to know their client, which is, I'm persuaded now, is essential if you're to do one of these cases properly.
You're impressed by the defense. Were you impressed by any of the prosecutors?
Yes, I saw one prosecutor whom I think is probably very able indeed. And I have been aware of other prosecutors. I certainly have a very high regard for Robert Morgenthau, for example, in New York. I'm not out to throw the legal system out the window, but I very much think it needs serious reform.
Speaking of money, how much money do you think Steve Bright makes a year?
Well, I know what he is paid. I think they may have given themselves a raise. They used to be made, the whole crowd from top to bottom, from the receptionist right on up or down. It's a very unhierarchical place. We're paid $23,000, which is, I don't know how on earth they live on it in a city like Atlanta.
Well, this would be the group at 83
Poplar Street.
Poplar Street. What's the name of the group?
It's called the Southern Center for Human Rights. I always like the fact that when the telephone is answered, they just say law offices. Somehow or other, the Southern Center for Human Rights sounds a little hefty to me. They're in the business of keeping clients alive, and so that they. You know, the title is Proximity to Death. I'm up close on it, but also it comes from a line from a wonderful book by Tim O'Brien about the Vietnam War, and he has this line. Perhaps you could read it. It's.
I'm looking for it. It's right here.
Yeah.
It's, any soldier will tell you, if he tells the truth, that proximity to death brings with it a corresponding proximity to life, in a work called The Things They Carried.
Right. And I spotted that in that book, and that seemed to me exactly what I was trying to show in the book, was the sense of life of these lawyers, the sense of they're trying to keep their clients alive, of the jurors with great sense of responsibility facing the question of life and death.
How many lawyers are we talking about in this Southern Center?
Well, there were only 6 at that time. I think they've now mushroomed into a huge empire of 11. But it's a tiny band.
Where does the money come from?
It's all privately donated. They were very strapped, and there are no federal funds for this kind of thing at all anymore, and so that they have to rely on passing the tin cup.
Am I correct that all of the events of this book take place in the South?
Yes, and that's, I'm aware of that as a problem, because I'm just as opposed to the death penalty in Massachusetts as I am in Georgia. And California has as virulent a death row culture as any state short of Texas. But Georgia was where I lived then. It was where I encountered this. And I wanted very much to look at a little precise situation and not try scanning the 50 states or attempting a kind of overall history of the death penalty. I wanted it to be focused on a very few cases, very few people, and so it's Georgia with one excursion over into Alabama.
Do you think the same kind of book could be written about, let's say, the Pacific Northwest?
Yes, I do.
What went into the decision of making this a relatively short book? Because it's, even with the notes, or without the notes, it's about 187 pages.
It's very short. I was aware of that. But it seemed to me that I had, I'd said what I wanted to say. That anything more would be padding. I was afraid, I think, that I might get hortatory. I wanted it to be a quiet book. I tried to close in a quiet way. It was the idea that it might make people think about the issue in a slightly different way. I hope that I might persuade some people to imagine themselves in a courtroom and see it.
And what is your hope in terms of the effect of the book?
Well, historians ought not try to be prophets, and we certainly it does not look good right now. We have strong support for the death penalty in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Anyone up for an appointment has to face that. The Supreme Court is shortening, has done, I think, great damage to the habeas corpus, the writ of habeas corpus. They're trying to shorten the appeals process. The country, we're told by polls that a vast majority of people in this country favor the death penalty. But there are other signs. It looks as if Justice Breyer may be has taken on Justice Thomas on a particular issue, but he may be scratching his head about the death penalty. So that we don't have any Thurgood Marshall or William Brennan anymore simply saying that the death penalty is wrong, absolutely wrong, a violation of the 8th Amendment to cruel and unusual punishment. But one sign of it, I think, would be the families of victims that are calling not for the death penalty, but instead asking for mercy. Matt Shepard, the young gay man who was chained to a fence and left to die after he was beaten, when his murderers were sentenced to, facing a sentence and quite possibly would get life, one of them. Matt Shepard's father, with his mother standing, with the boy's mother standing at his side, said, "We want mercy for someone who had shown no mercy, and that his punishment will be having to live with his crime for the rest of his life."
In terms of you being a historian, I want to go to a quotation from the next to the last page of the text where you said, "I will know the people from the office," meaning the Poverty Law Center,
right,
"but I will sit apart from them. I will do so because I am not one of them. I can and do share their convictions, but I do not work alongside them. All I can do is the job I undertook, what seems so long ago, to tell their story." So here you are as an historian. You've told a current story. Will you now go back to being an historian?
Well, I don't know where I'll go next with the book, but what I was trying to get across there, I was trying to be honest, that I don't think that I have made the kind of contribution that I know they're making all of the time, every day as they work on these cases, that I would be presumptuous to think that I was in the same league with them. But on the other hand, I do think telling their story is an important matter, and that's what I've tried to do with this book, is get people to see that there are remarkable lawyers who are out there fighting the death penalty.
Do you think that this experience, that is, you've got a book between hardcovers now out in the market, will affect the way you write history?
I would guess so. I think people have kidded me over the years that they can hear me in sentences in Grant and sentences in my biography of Frederick Douglass, and pulled my leg about that. I would still feel a responsibility to write in a much more distanced way if I were to do a biography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, let's say, but Jane Addams. But I think I know I'd stick with the third person, but I suspect that even more of me would be there in the book than has been in the past.
In your future histories?
Yeah, I would think so.
And why is that?
Well, I've always resisted this phrase, the ivory tower. I didn't ever feel I was in an ivory tower when I was teaching American history in colleges or universities. But actually getting out and into a grim, difficult, but very compelling situation matters. I think the analogy would be that I've learned over the years that I'd like to see and know as much as I can about the places that the persons about whom I'm writing, where they lived and how they lived, and get a sense of it. To see Galena, Illinois mattered with the Grant book. To see the rather nice little house up on the bluff that he had lived in with his wife and children, that was the better part of his life. To see where the store was, where he'd been a very unhappy clerk, that mattered. With Frederick Douglass, I was corny as all get out, but I was in a rented car, and I drove along the road with a map I had, pulled over, took off my shoes and socks, rolled up my pants, and walked up the little creek to where the cabin where he was born was. I guess I've been writing myself into those stories already. I suspect there might be more of it now.
What is currently in the hopper?
Well, I'm not sure. This is very unusual, and normally when I finished a book, I've already got another one going, but I haven't. I do feel very strongly that you have to be tremendously committed to a topic to write a good book about it, and I haven't found that new topic yet.
We'll be here when you do.
Thanks very much.
William McFeely, author, Proximity to Death. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.